This conference will now be recorded.
Mother Teresa of Calcutta was put on a fast track and was accepted as a saint just a few years ago. A particularly interesting fast track was Pope John Paul II, who died in 2005 and was canonized in 2013. So he skipped almost all the steps that we have just outlined for a movement to sainthood. Now let's go to the life of Augustus Tolton. And it starts with his mother. Martha Jane Chisley was a slave in Kentucky, and sometime between 1840 and 1850, she was given as a wedding present to a family in Missouri, over around Brush Creek, Missouri. Martha Jane Chisley is really the hero of the entire Augustus Tolton story. She worked on a farm. They might have called it a plantation near Brush Creek.
I guess people can't hear. I don't understand what the problem is.
Oh,
So,
did you turn the mic off, his mic off, and use your phone line?
there isn't a mic for them.
I know.
Can people hear us now?
can you hear me?
That mic's on.
You sound fine,
Yeah.
Dave.
I do. I hear you.
Okay, some people say they can't hear, so we'll keep going. I apologize, but I don't understand. Some people may need to unmute or turn their speakers up. So we'll keep going. Sorry.
Okay, Martha Jane Chisley worked on a farm for a family called the Elliots, who happened to be the great-great-great-grandparents of a former dean at Quincy University, Gary Carter. Martha Jane met her potential partner who worked in an adjacent farm. His name was Peter Tolton, and the Elliots ensured that their slaves could be baptized. And so Martha Jane and Peter Tolton were Catholics who married in the Catholic Church. Martha Jane gave birth to 3 children. Charlie was the oldest boy, Augustus, the middle child, and a daughter, Anne. In 1863, during the Civil War and after Abraham Lincoln invited African American slaves to join the Union Army, Peter Tolton escaped from his plantation with the intent of joining the Union Army. From this point on, his story is very blurred. Whether he actually, there are some who say he fought in the Union Army and was killed in action. Others say that he became ill even before Army service and passed away. But either way, none of the family would ever see Peter again. So that's what he did in 1863. And at that time, Mrs. Tolton decided she was going to do the same, and that is escape from slavery. So she took her 3 children, went cross country towards Hannibal, which was probably a trek of at least 25 miles, and then rode across the river to the Illinois banks, the banks of a free state. And then she trekked on another 20 or so miles north to the city of Quincy. And among the slaves, the city of Quincy was seen as a wonderful place of refuge. The Underground Railroad had been here, and so the kindness of the city towards slaves was manifest. So this begins their life in Quincy. The family, they're baptized, and they immediately began to attend St. Boniface Church. And St. Boniface Church at this time was predominant population of Germans. And the sermons at Sunday Mass were in German. And the young Augustus began learning the German language, and he was seen to be pretty adept at picking up languages. Charlie, Augustus, and their mother were employed at a cigar factory in Quincy, rolling cigars, which was a rather horrific job. Apparently, after a day of rolling cigars, why the body was reeking with odors from the tobacco. Unfortunately, in that very first year, Charlie, the oldest, passed away. Augustus, who began to acquire the nickname Gus, and this remained pretty much for the rest of his life, was very interested in being educated. And so often in the evenings, after a day at the cigar factory, he would go to St. Boniface School to be tutored by the nuns of St. Boniface. Augustus was a very bright young man, and he was essentially pretty much recruited for another school, the school of St. Lawrence. This parish had its name changed to St. Peter. And here enters in another one of the heroes of the life of Augustus Tolton, and that's Father Peter McGurk, an Irish immigrant who was the priest and pastor of St. Peter's Church. So Augustus began his training, his education at St. Peter's School. Not surprisingly, the black student in attendance at the school created some dissidents, as a matter of fact, almost revolt. Parents said, we'll not allow our child to be educated with a black child. Father McGurr accepted this as a challenge, and virtually weekly he addressed this issue in his homilies, and he said, Augustus is going to stay. This bright young man will be our student. Augustus was a very bright student, and Father McGurr chose him to teach Sunday school to indicate his talents. So education meant an awful lot to Augustus Tolton. And the next step was to go beyond the elementary to St. Francis College, which becomes Quincy College and ultimately Quincy University. So Augustus Tolton made it clear to the Franciscans at St. Francis that he was interested in becoming a priest. And a Franciscan became his friend and a person committed to educate Augustus for the priesthood. Father Michael Riker of the St. Francis faculty, Father Michael OFM, taught and made sure that Augustus learned both Greek and Latin. And these were essential for admission to seminary. Then the next step was for the turning in one's application to seminaries to be accepted into these seminaries. And so letters went out virtually to every possible seminary, every possible one in the United States. Universally, the return letter said, we will not accept a black student. And so it seemed that the path toward the priesthood was over. However, Father Michael had contacts in Rome with the head of the Franciscan order in Rome, the minister general of the order. And so they petitioned and they said, certainly we will accept Augustus Tolton as our student. With the acceptance in 1880, Augustus was on his way to Rome, where he would stay for 6 years. His education was at the University of the Propaganda, which was the part of the seminary which was for the training of missionaries. So Augustus Tolton was enthusiastic. I will be a missionary to Africa. In 1886, he finished his education, and on Holy Saturday in 1886, he was ordained at the Church of St. John Lateran in Rome. St. John Lateran is the cathedral basilica of the Pope. And so this is where he is anointed as a priest. And the next day, Easter Sunday of 1886, he said his first Mass at St. Peter's, the St. Peter's Basilica in Rome. And then he was ready to go to his next destination, which he expected to be Africa. But the head of his college, the propaganda said, there is a missionary place that you can go, and that's where I want to send you. And that is to Quincy, Illinois, which could be considered mission country as far as a Black priest is concerned. So Augustus returns, Father Gus now, and he says his first Mass at St. Boniface Church in downtown Quincy. A huge crowd attended the Mass. Father Tolton was essentially something of a celebrity, a unique person, and former slave, now a Catholic priest. Father Tolton was provided by the bishop with a parish in the city of Quincy. And this parish was what would now be Jersey Street, called St. Joseph Catholic Church. It was for Black parishioners. Unfortunately, the number of Black Catholics in Quincy was precious few. Most of them belonged to churches, but Protestant denominations. And Augustus was eager to see if he could bring about conversion of a number of his fellow Africans. At his church, Father Tolton became something of a celebrity. He was noted for the brilliance of his homilies, and he was noted for the superb voice that he possessed. And at that time in the Catholic Church, a significant ceremony was High Mass, where the prayers are essentially sung. And Father Tolton was superb in both speaking and singing. So his church had multiple people from the other churches in the community. And this was to cause quite a rift. The pastor of St. Boniface went to Father Tolton and he said, I'm forbidding my parishioners to go to your parish. And he said, if they do go, what money they might put in the collection basket, I demand that you turn it over to my parish. So this was a real subject of controversy. And ultimately, it got so bad that the priests from other parishes requested to the bishop that Father Tolton, Father Gus be transferred. And the bishop succumbed and saw to it that Father Gus was transferred to Chicago. So he went, of course, his mother went with him, and soon he had a parish, which at first met in storefronts, and then uh, created a church on the south side, St. Monica's, which was his parish. And Tolton spent the next probably 3 years of his life trying to raise money to build a worthy church for the African American population in Chicago. And he was really a beloved figure, but he traveled significantly. He befriended a Mother Superior, Mother Margaret Drexel, Catherine Drexel, who was known to want to support both Native Americans and former slaves. So she was very, very active in providing support for the underprivileged. So their friendship is one of the things that is used in the sainthood process for Mother Gus. Now, moving up the ladder to venerable, there is, before he becomes a canonized saint, a requisite that he be considered to be rewarded by God with 2 miracles. And this brings up a most intriguing story. There was, in 2016, bishops converged upon Quincy to accomplish another requirement of the path to sainthood, and that is that his remains must be examined. So Father Tolton's grave was dug up, the casket opened, and was subsequently determined that without a doubt that the remains there were those of Augustus Tolton, a black man. While at this, the bishops present prayed for Father Tolton's intercession. And at this time, there was a very serious problem. A young seminarian in Chicago was in a coma. And there were procedures going on to see if his organs could be donated for transplant. The nurses of this seminarian said that this man's brain function had ceased, in effect, that he was dead. The nurses left the room, and when they came back, the seminarian had his eyes open, and he was looking at them and was ready to communicate. And they were absolutely astonished. This, they said, is a miracle. Quite interestingly, a former Quincy mayor, Chuck Schultz, was at that service at the grave, and he was using his cell phone. And so it was possible to see where the prayer for the seminarian and the recovery, and they found that it dovetailed. perfectly that as this prayer was rendered, the man who had been adjudged dead was seen as alive. The pastor of St. Francis now, this is one of his friends, and he says that this man is now a pastor of a church in Wisconsin. So this is what seems to be an inescapable miracle submitted, but it has not yet been accepted. The idea that perhaps there were coincidence or natural explanations has to be considered before it can be absolutely determined as a miracle. But everybody who was there said there can be no doubt this is a Father Tolton miracle. The bishop in Chicago, Bishop Perry, responsible for pushing forward Father Tolton's cause, says that there are actually two miracles that they have submitted and that are being studied in the Vatican. Now, my hope is that these could put Father Gus on a fast track. I am very close to being 90 years old, and I am very, very hopeful that Father Tolton is a saint in my lifetime so that I can experience the joys of his sainthood. Now, fast track, is there any rationale to me in our country with issues that we've seen of racism and of concern, Black Lives Matter? It would seem that Augustus Tolton would be the perfect person to say, we have an African American who becomes actually the third American saint. Now, let me just summarize a little bit. There are the heroes, and his mother is without question the paramount hero. There is Father McGurk at St. Peter's, who, despite heavy criticism, persisted in caring for Tolton's education and making sure he was educated properly in his school. Then there was Father Reichert, OFM, who championed his study for the priesthood at Quincy College. Now, in a number of the things that you can look at online, it will mention that he is a graduate of Quincy University under the name of St. Francis Solanus College. I think that is a little doubtful, but it is true that he studied with the Franciscans at the college, at this college. So Quincy College, Quincy University can legitimately consider him as one of theirs. Now, I'd like to talk about the future for just a second. I might suggest that you can go online and see the exhumation of Father Tolton's body. I did it and I didn't like it, but it's there. You can see his remains in that open casket. Now, the St. Peter's Cemetery is in a rather unimposing part of Quincy. At one end of the cemetery is Kentucky Fried Chicken. At the other end is Wendy's, I believe. So, you know, my hopes would be that ultimately, Father Tolton's remains would be moved to St. Boniface Church, which would become his shrine. Wouldn't it be marvelous if Quincy had a shrine to the one and only former slave to have accomplished all the things that he did? He is one, there's still possibilities of asking God for favors in the name of Father Augustus Tolton, as happened with that seminarian. Now, Father Bishop Perry says a lot of people that said, I prayed to Tolton concerning my job, and my prayer was answered. I prayed to Tolton because of some issues in my marriage, and my prayers were answered. But these are not considered miraculous. And so, there's still that path that is needed before the final step of St. Augustus Tolton, first former slave, to be a priest, to be venerable, and hopefully to be St. Augustus Tolton. Now, I hope you join with me in seeing this as an issue and a response for our former Quincy student to be elevated to the sainthood. St. Francis postscript is journeying to Assisi in a few days, and I'm very hopeful that a companion might be the Minister General of the Franciscan Order, namely Father Michael Perry, who is a graduate of Quincy University with a double major in philosophy and history. He is only the second American ever to be Minister General of the Order, and he is the 100th successor of St. Francis. So I hope that Father Michael can just touch Pope Francis on the elbow and say, we've got a cause there, Quincy, Illinois, for a potential saint. I appreciate the chance to bring up these issues to you, and I hope you have a wonderful homecoming, virtual though it may be, and when the opportunity arises that you return to campus and resume friendships with so many of those people that were special to you on this campus. So thank you very much.
And if you have questions for Dr. Costigan, feel free to just mention those in the chat. We'll relay them to him, and then he can answer them. So we'll wait just a few minutes here and see if anybody has questions.
Very good.
Somebody asked about, isn't there a new high school named after Father Chilton?
Yes, indeed. There is a high school in Columbia, Missouri, Father Tolton High School. So this is indication of something of his esteem, and that is apparently a thriving school over in Columbia. Now, there are a lot of Drexel schools in this country for Mother Drexel, and I think if Father Gus makes it to sainthood, we'll see other. As a matter of fact, I think there is a elementary school in Chicago now calling itself Father Tolton Elementary.
Any other questions? We'll wait just another minute and see if we have another question. Is St. Boniface Church closed?
Yes,
And we
St.
make a brief
Boniface
stop.
Church is closed, which seems, and it's a beautiful church and a especially nice location on Main Street in Quincy. And it would be ideal as a shrine. And I can just imagine if we have this former slave saint, that this would become a place of pilgrimage for African American Catholics. Now, I participated in some activities where there's a guild in Chicago, the Tolton Guild, which raises money to provide for the expenses of the path to sainthood. And these people are very enthusiastic. I mean, Quincy becomes a special place for these people. And one year, probably 10 or so years ago, why they brought a choir of, I think, all female voices, and they were spectacular in their singing and in their praises for Father Tolton.
So, folks, we thank you for joining us for this first part of the Alumni College, and we thank Dr. Costigan for his dedicated and loyal service to this fine institution. And we apologize for the audiovisual issues. We're in a computer lab that you would think we wouldn't have computer issues, but that was not the case, and we had a few glitches, and we apologize, I know, for the grainy video and all the other issues. So if you want to hang tight with us, we are going to switch everything over. We'll keep this meeting open and running. So at this time, I will turn it over and introduce Dr. Kim Hale from our biology department and Dr. Jonathan Miles from our philosophy department. And I'm going to let them kind of take over from here, and I'll keep working on trying to share that screen.
Hello.
Hello. Jonathan, do you want to talk? Because I'm going to get my other computer.
So this is just kind of a rehash of something we did right when the virus kind of hit in the spring of last year, March. And there was all kinds of questions about, you know, what was the virus? What was it doing? How do we take, how do we take precautions? Those kinds of things. And that led to some ethical questions about, people were asking, am I exposing people to risk by, ordering food and having it brought to my door? And, we weren't even in the mask phase yet. We weren't even thinking about those kinds of discussions yet. And so they just asked us to come together and kind of reproduce that conversation. So Dr. Hale and I were sitting in a room together. I was wearing gloves. I did have a mask on at the time, and it was a lovely mask. And I'm really happy that I don't have to talk through it tonight. And so Dr. Hale sort of gave a presentation on what the virus is like, what do we mean by co-SARS 19 and all of that, and what's a coronavirus, and why do we have products that could kill coronavirus and it hadn't even shown up before yet, because coronavirus is a big category of lots of different kinds of viruses. And so Dr. Hale, have I talked enough for you to?
Yeah, I'm good now. Thank you.
Okay.
So I'll give kind of some background about the virus and everything, and then towards the end, one of the last slides that I will talk about will be like how long does the virus live on different things, and then I should have made that my last slide, I guess. So maybe I'll just do that, even though that's not the way it is in the presentation. And then we can kind of pick up on, like, when you're touching something that's delivered or something like that, what risk is it posing? So again, so the virus, so the disease is called COVID-19. So that means coronavirus disease, and then 19 is the year 2019. And then the virus that actually causes the disease is SARS-CoV-2. So again, some of you might remember the SARS epidemic that occurred back in the early 2000s. So this virus is closely related to the coronavirus that caused that outbreak as well. And I had a picture of the virus. Oh, there, Matt's sharing the screen now. So that was, that was way to go, Matt. Woo! So that was the slide I was just talking about. And then there's a picture of the virus on the next slide. So it kind of has glycoproteins and M proteins, right? It is an RNA virus. So if any of you have any viral background, you know that there are either DNA viruses or RNA viruses. And so RNA viruses tend to be more responsible for outbreaks because there are more mutations that occur. So RNA viruses we tend to hear about them causing disease a lot more. Okay, you can go to the next slide, Matt, if you can. So as Jonathan said, you might have noticed that there were already things out that said that they killed the coronavirus. So again, that's because there are multiple coronaviruses. So I already mentioned that SARS was caused by the coronavirus. So you can see that there in 2003. And then there are several coronaviruses that just cause symptoms of like the common cold. So they're not near as serious. Then there's MERS, which is Middle Eastern Respiratory Syndrome. That was in 2012. There was a big outbreak, but it still occurs there. And then they still have a question by SARS-CoV-2 in this image, but we're pretty sure that it was spread. So you can see some of them are spread by bats, and then like the MERS goes from bats into camels and then into humans. And so we're pretty sure that SARS-CoV-2 came from a pangolin. So you can show that picture on the next slide, Matt. So we're pretty sure that this is the animal that is responsible for transmitting the virus.
So sad because they're so cute.
And then we
Aren't
can
they?
go to the next
They're
slide.
so cute.
And the next slide gets into the actual spread of the disease. So you guys are probably aware that it's spread through respiratory droplets. So again, coughing, sneezing, talking, singing, all of those activities release respiratory droplets into the air. And then this slide kind of gives the idea of how far do different respiratory droplets actually travel. So there's still a little bit of debate. Guys might notice that science is actually playing out in real time. We don't actually discover things about new novel viruses that quickly, so there's still studies being done. So 6 feet is kind of the accepted, although there are still some scientists who think that these are the even smaller size particles that would go potentially further than 6 feet. So that's why 6 feet and a mask is like what people really recommend for being protected. And then we can go to the next slide. This is the one that you can keep in mind and we can come back to and think about when we're talking about it. So how long does the virus last? So this is just from a fairly recent paper that was published in the New England Journal of Medicine. So how long does it last outside a body? So again, we know that it's not going to replicate outside of the body because again, viruses need a host cell to be able to replicate, but how long can it be viable? So as an aerosol in the air, they think up to 3 hours, and then it goes on copper up to 4 hours. And then you can see some of the ones that people might be more concerned about. So on cardboard, up to 24 hours, on plastic, 2 to 3 days, and on stainless steel, 2 to 3 days. And then the next slide is kind of a comparison to the seasonal flu, because you kind of hear that a lot, that, oh, it's just like the flu. Well, it's not just like the flu. It's a different virus, and it has a lot of similar symptoms, but other than that, it's really distinctive from the flu. So again, you're going to have more people affected. Again, incubation time is much longer, and of course that causes problems when you're talking about containment and spread, because if people don't know they have it, that's actually when they're most likely to spread it. And if it can incubate from 1 to 14 days, people can just be walking around just doing regular things and not thinking that they need to take precautions. And so they can be spreading it, or again, maybe they're taking precautions in public, but they're not taking precautions around their close friends and family, and so you get like spreading within family groups or friend groups. And the hospitalization rate is significantly higher. And then fatality rate also projected to be significantly higher than the seasonal flu. So today we actually just hit 2,000 deaths in the US from COVID so far. And then the next slide. So if Matt still wants to send this out to people, this is a good link. This is from Johns Hopkins, and it will actually take you to, you can go to a map of just the US or a map of the world, or like a map of Illinois or Missouri or wherever you may live currently. And it will tell you like number of tests, number of people tested, number of confirmed cases, number of deaths, and it's like constantly being updated. So again, it's just a good resource if you want to see, again, worldwide and locally in your local area, what's going on with the virus, kind of minute by minute. And then the final slide is, again, just something that I like to do when I teach emerging infectious diseases, is to get people to think about responsibility for like these outbreaks that occur. So responsibility for this current pandemic. So I had the pangolin earlier. Well, it's not really the pangolin's fault, right? The pangolin was just living its life, right? And people came into contact with it. So there's the virus, and then there are humans. That's really the two things that are responsible for the pandemic. So what's significant about this virus? Well, of course, it's infectious, so it causes disease in humans, so that causes an issue for us. It's easily transmissible from human to human, so again, spreading via respiratory droplets, that's a really effective way for just pathogens in general to spread. It's not too lethal, so we did say that it was more lethal, that the lethality rate would be higher than the flu, but it's not super lethal, right? If viruses are significantly lethal, then they will just die out because they will kill off their host too fast. And it does have, as I showed in slide 6, an ability to survive outside of the host. So again, it can't reproduce outside of the host, but it can survive for significant periods of time outside of the host, and that also increases its transmission rate. So humans responsibility. So travel is a big one. So the more global society we become, the more people are going from place to place, multiple places in a day. You just have, again, more human contact, more chance for spreading pathogens. Again, contact with wild animals. We always want to blame the animal, whatever the animal is that's spreading the disease, but we're the ones usually that are going out and invading their habitat and making contact with them or trying to hunt them or whatever the particular case may be. Living in densely populated areas, and then of course the big one that really becomes significant with this current pandemic is not staying home when sick. So again, I think we're seeing people stay home more now because of the pandemic. But again, before we knew what was going on, people who had just like cold-like symptoms were still going out and doing their day-to-day activities because that's just what people usually do. Oh, it's just a cold, so I'm just going to do all the things I would normally do. And of course, they could have been spreading this particular virus while they were doing those things. So yeah, so we can think back, we can talk about anything you guys want to, but we can think back to that, how long the virus lives outside of things, and then Jonathan and I can talk again about like the risks potentially that are posed when you do different activities.
Right. So I should mention I am teaching two sections of bioethics this semester. So you can imagine we talk a lot about the ethical implications of this virus, and there are three principles that are sort of universally acknowledged within medicine. We call them clinical ethical principles. And those principles are really important to how we look at risk and exposing other people to risk. And I just want to mention them, and then I'm going to type them into the chat here so that you can have those principles in front of you. But the first principle is the principle of autonomy. The principle of autonomy is the principle of self-determination, right? People should be free to, all things being equal, to do what it is that they want to do. The the default is autonomy. The default is that people should be able to live their lives the way that they want to. However, there are some exceptions to the principle of autonomy, and one of them is called the harm principle, HARM, and it's usually associated with John Stuart Mill, the 19th century British philosopher and parliamentarian, but member of parliament. But he never actually mentions the word harm principle. But essentially, I bet, I'm just guessing, that when I mentioned that people, all things being equal, people ought to be able to live their lives the way they want to, in the back of your mind, there was this little but as long as they don't harm others and or put others at risk of harm. And that's what the harm principle says. We should not interfere with your autonomy, your self-determination, provided you don't place others at risk of harm or cause harm themselves. And the obligation that we have not to commit harm is another principle, which is hard for me to spell. I think I spelled it correctly there. Non-maleficence. This is the familiar do no harm principle. And the way those three principles interact with each other is I do have autonomy unless I represent a risk to other people. Then my autonomy can be infringed on. Sometimes I might need to be compensated for infringing on my autonomy, perhaps. Um, Suppose that my house presents a risk to people around me or something along those lines, and I have to, you know, give up my house or move or something along those lines, that I might need to be compensated for it. But normally, the harm principle is one in which your right to do what you want to ends at putting me at risk. So sometimes it's referred to as your right to swing your arm ends at my nose. The problem with the virus is that it increases our reach. It increases our risk, and we don't even and we're not even aware of it. Dr. Hale, Kim, she called me Jonathan, and that's the way we normally talk to each other. So I'll just say Kim, who is an incredibly good teacher and biologist, has, pointed out that this virus lasts on surfaces and all kinds of things, which just scares the daylights out of me. But it also means that I expose other people to risk if I have the virus and I don't know it, or if I have the virus and I do know it. I have a moral obligation not to cause harm to others or put them at risk of harm if I can do so. And that's the reason why masks are such an important thing. They do infringe on my autonomy. I don't like them. I've had to go home on several occasions because I forgot my mask and I wanted to go to the grocery store or something along those lines. But uh, it is a clearly an ethical obligation I have not to put others at risk. And so, therefore, my autonomy, my freedom can be infringed for that reason. And that's the reason why, if everybody wears a mask out in public, we really do cut down on these sorts of things. So I hope that that gets across the sort of the ethical conversations that we have in my class. Um, we're reading a book on the ethics of the pandemic, and it's a series of articles by Canadians and Americans on this issue. And so we get into a lot of discussion about this sort of thing. And uh, those three principles are the ones that come into play the most often. And I'm happy to take questions or uh, or whatever. But yeah.
So we'll open it up for questions. If anybody has questions for Dr. Miles or Dr. Hale, feel free to actually just jump right in, unmute yourself, or you can put them in the comments.
I thought I had heard that even though they live on things like plastic and boxes, that you really aren't harmed much as long as you go get the mail and you wash your hands. Is there anything that says you have to do anything other than that to keep yourself safe?
Yeah, that's correct. I mean, washing your hands is actually one of the best preventions. Washing your hands for at least 20 seconds, really good. After you're right, like after you touch the mail or whatever. The problem is I don't think nearly as many people realize how much of a face toucher they are, because like if you watch people, they touch, so they will pick up the mail and then they will touch their face and then they will go wash their hands. Well, if you already touched your face, that's like the prime area. If it gets in like your nostrils or your mouth, right, it's going to get into the respiratory tract where it's going to cause infection. So you are correct. Washing your hands is good prevention as long as you're not touching something and then touching your face before you wash your hands.
I want to ask the question of Dr. Hale. So, when we had that slide where the how the droplets spread and that sort of thing, do we have any idea how? Like, one of the things that I've heard is that we can mitigate our risk of harm a lot by having discussions or having our conversations outdoors. If we're over 6 feet apart and we're spread out and we're outside, that the the droplets are, they're certainly not rendered inert, but a lot less risky. And I just wonder what you thought about that.
Yeah, so part of the idea of being outside is that there's just more air circulation. So even inside, the more air circulation that you have, the better, because it's moving things around, and usually like you want to, like if you have fans or something, you want to have them blowing away from people. So that's part of the benefit of being outside. And then obviously just the greater distance. So if you can be further apart, that's better. Is it 100% safer? Or like, are you 100% safe if you're outside? No, but are you
Right.
safer than if you're in an enclosed room? Yes, definitely, because there's going to be more airflow. Actually, I didn't get a chance to read it yet, but there was an interesting article that I saw that said like potentially different languages will like spread like the SARS-CoV-2 virus more because of the way you actually move your mouth and like the amount of respiratory droplets that are emitted just in speaking. And I guess that English is one of the worst languages for that, this article said. But like I said, I haven't really had a chance to read it, but it seems kind of interesting.
Lots of labial vowels and sort of using the lips and the roof of the tongue on the roof of the mouth and that sort of thing.
I have a question. If the virus can last 2 to 3 days on plastic, does that mean we should throw away or wash our grocery bags when we come home with plastic grocery bags? How much care do we need to take with that sort of thing? Celery comes in a plastic bag. Should we wash those bags with soap and water, or what do we do?
I don't know what exactly the right thing to do. I think again, everyone needs to kind of establish like what they think their own risk level is. If you're at higher risk, then you should take as many precautions as possible. Definitely though, like I would recommend, well, I mean, I do this anyways, but I would recommend like fruits and vegetables that come in plastic bags. I would take the fruits and vegetables out and like wash them off and then put them in your own, either your own bags or your own containers. I wouldn't put like a plastic bag or like a plastic container that like cherry tomatoes come in or something. I wouldn't put that in my refrigerator, right, with my other food. I know a lot of people are washing off their groceries like in their garage before they come inside. Again, I guess it depends.
Kim, does cold kill the virus?
Um, see, that's the thing about viruses. Like viruses aren't like technically alive like to begin with, so that we get into kind of this tricky language like
I mean,
but
does it render it inert? Does it neutralize it?
there haven't been a lot of studies done about it. I doubt if refrigerator temperatures will completely inactivate it. The freezer probably would, just like the idea of freezing that RNA and then thawing it, that would probably render it completely inactive. Refrigerator temperatures may slow it down, but I wouldn't say that it's going to be completely inactive at 4 degrees.
Is there any way to travel in a car with someone safely? Because you're not 6 foot away. If you open your windows, are you more safe?
If you open your windows, you're more safe. Is this like someone that, are we talking about a complete stranger or someone that you're around anyways, or is this just a general question?
General question, but for a stranger. So if you want to go somewhere with a friend, is it safe to, do you have to take your own cars? Or if you open your window, are you okay?
So I think there are, again, a lot of things that come into play. If it's a short trip, then if you open your window, you're probably going to be okay. I wouldn't say you're okay. If it's I mean, if you're going to be in the car with someone for like hours, I think that's a big risk, right? That, I mean, you can wear your mask in a car, I guess, but you're still not going to be 6 feet apart and masked, and that probably wouldn't be a very pleasurable ride. Um, so yeah, I think that is a risk that a lot of people aren't really thinking about, is that if you're getting into a car is a pretty confined, enclosed space. There's not a lot of circulating air. That really is a big risk.
I think it's important that we talk about these things in terms of smaller risks, greater risks, because you're never going to be 100% safe, and so it's really a kind of a trade-off situation, right? I mean, um, you have to go places sometimes, and so you take the least risk that you can to others, and then also the least risk to yourself. But it's always going to be a calculation.
Do we have any other questions for Dr. Hale or for Dr. Miles at this point?
So Jonathan, what do you think about going to eat at restaurants now that they're starting to reopen? Do you think that there's an ethical issue in that? Because before we were talking about takeout because everything was closed, but now you can go in and sit down at a restaurant. So what do you think the
Yeah.
ethical issues with that
The
are?
question is, do I increase the risk of others if I go to a restaurant wearing a mask or something like that? Forgive me, I have to sneeze. It's not COVID. We all say that when I got into an allergy attack in an Aldi when I was getting groceries, and I had my mask on, but I was just sneezing and sneezing. And I'm like, I just want to say to everybody, it's not COVID. At least I don't think it is. So the question is it ethical for me to go to a restaurant? And I would say that with proper precautions, it might be worth the trade-off, right? So you wear your mask, you sit far away. I really like the idea that here in Illinois we've got these restaurants that have like either permanently bought or rented tents, and we're all sitting out, and that's possibly a little bit better as long as it seems to be if the flaps are opened up, and you've got a lot of air running through there. But I I haven't gone to any restaurants and eaten, that I can think of. I mean, we've always done takeout, leave and take things out, or eaten outside. Um, but am I increasing the risk of the people around me? Maybe some. If we don't go to restaurants, then we may very well harm the people that actually do have to work, right? I mean, harm is not the right word. We may very well, affect their livelihood, and that could make them worse off. But I don't think that there's any moral obligation to like go out and I don't think any of us are morally obligated to go and sit in a restaurant. Is it morally permissible to do so? Notice I'm making a distinction between something being an obligation, as in if I don't do it, there's bad things, I've done something bad, or permissible, which means I can do it, provided, I take proper precautions and those sorts of things. And I just wouldn't recommend doing it a lot, but I do think that it could be permissible under limited circumstances, perhaps. For example, I don't think that restaurants are doing something unethical by serving people. Provided they're making having proper precautions, that sort of thing. So one of the things that I get asked a lot is it unethical for Buffalo Wild Wings to make me work? And I would say no, I don't think so. They're following the guidelines of the state and taking the proper precautions. Then I don't think that it's a violation of non-maleficence. But that said, sort of being reckless and we're just going to let anybody come in and nobody, we're not going to enforce any masks or any of those kinds of things could be unethical for both the staff and the patrons.
And the crazy problem that's going on right now, if you don't mind me jumping in, is that there's no one authority that has jurisdiction or that will claim it, so that there's no one universal way that we should do things. Being a first responder that has had to cross jurisdictional lines, it's a very difficult, slippery slope out there.
Yeah, I'm thinking of some restaurants, that I've heard about on the news and things, just being really rather reckless about the whole thing. And I will say this, I mean, I'm sure I could listen to patients with people who want to argue, but I was saying this to my class the other day because they kind of pinned me down on the mask thing, and I would just say I don't think I have not heard any good arguments for why making masks, wearing masks, that you shouldn't wear it, or that you can just not wear one, or that sort of thing when you're in contact with other people. I just haven't heard any really good arguments about them, and I've heard a lot of arguments, right? It's a different question as to whether or not, well, should we fine all the people that don't wear masks? Well, that increases, sort of costs, and it may not be very effective, and all of those sorts of things. And actually, there have been some economists, which I've kind of chuckled at, that have, because economists think differently than all the rest of us. But I hang around a lot of economists, and they were just talking about, well, instead of punishing people who don't comply, can we give some sort of incentive to get people to comply? And I was reading a paper the other day that was calculating the issue of people who don't want to take vaccines, and everybody wants to trot out kind of like, well, we'll punish them, or we'll make them do it, so somehow we're going to hold them down and give them vaccines or something. And this paper was really looking at some of the I can't remember the name of it, but it was really looking at the idea of like paying people to comply. So it actually might be cheaper to well, I don't want to take the virus. I mean, I don't want to take the vaccine. So, well, here's $100. Oh, well, maybe I will. And you get compliance that way. So, I mean, I my point is that there's a big difference between everybody ought to do it, right? This is an obligation. I think people have an obligation to wear masks. If it's a little bit difficult to go from that to, well, we're going to punish the people who don't wear them. because that brings in the law of unintended consequences.
Nobody complains about no shirt, no shoes, no service.
That's true. That's very true. And notice how that's interesting, because that's not punishing someone. That's just the business making it known that they're not going to serve somebody who doesn't wear shoes. And I think you find this Menards has been just really remarkable with regard to this. At least what I've seen, the hardware company. You walk in the door, there's somebody standing there, and they're just going to tell you, if you don't have a mask on, you can't come in. And people bluster, they get all upset and everything, and whatnot. But then they say, well, we have these masks for 85 cents over here. You can have one. And people usually bluster and get all upset and my rights and all this, and then they just put the mask on and go on inside. That kind of I think is a lower transaction cost. I'm talking like an economist now. Than sort of fining people and those sorts of things.
Other questions before we wrap up for either Dr. Miles or Dr. Hale?
Yeah, so the bottom line is wear a mask, and peer pressure can sometimes be a wonderful thing.
Okay, I'd like to thank Dr. Miles and Dr. Hale for giving up some of their time this evening and joining us. I also want to apologize for some of our technical difficulties tonight. And thanks for sticking with us as we kind of did this first virtual alumni homecoming online, alumni college homecoming online. And we look forward to a full week of activities, and hope everybody has a great night. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
This is a lot of fun. Thanks.
Thank you.